Welcome to another episode of Software Explorations, Concepts, and Overviews hosted by yours truly, Tech Coach Ralph, where we are engineered to win. In today's episode of Software Explorations, we are going to do a brief review of what AWS, Amazon Web Services, Amplify is, how it's used, how to get started with it, and go from there, right? So let's not waste any time. Let's just jump right into it. Like I said, we're going to be looking into AWS Amplify. So let's just jump right into our agenda. So we're going to be discussing what exactly is AWS Amplify, the key aspects of AWS Amplify, how to get started with it, what are some of the backend services, the front-end development with it, some real-world use cases, including how I have personally used it, some best practices, and then we'll close on some community and resources. All right, so let's get into it. So what exactly is AWS Amplify? AWS Amplify is a set of tools and services provided by Amazon Web Services, AWS for short, that simplifies the process of developing and deploying web and mobile applications. It is designed to help developers build scalable and secure cloud-powered applications with ease. So what are some of the key aspects of AWS Amplify? So there's backend services. There is the Amplify CLI. CLI stands for Command Line Interface. There's the Amplify console that you use in the web browser. We were using it the other day on a live stream where we're attempting to deploy an application. There is authentication, there's front-end frameworks, there's GraphQL and REST APIs. You can see real-time data. There's hosting and deployment, mobile development, and collaboration with CI and CD, continuous integration and continuous deployment. So how would someone get started with AWS Amplify? So there's getting started on the web and there's getting started for mobile, right? They are very similar, but slight differences. So let's talk about that real quick. So if you're getting started on the web, you're going to set up your dev environment. So that would be how you set it up on your computer, your local environment. You're going to install the Amplify CLI, the command line interface as we mentioned. You're going to configure Amplify, and each of these steps, right, there's commands to follow, and it should be pretty straightforward to follow along. They make it very easy to get started, not too complicated. You're going to initialize a new Amplify project. Then you're going to add backend services if you have it, deploy the backend services, and then you're going to integrate those backend services with the front end, right? And like I said, there's commands to initialize it, to install it, to configure it, all of that. So it's just a matter of following the directions. It shouldn't be too hard to ramp up with it. And now from the mobile point of view, very similar, but you're going to be setting up your dev environment, installing the Amplify and the mobile command line interface. You're going to configure Amplify. Then we're going to create a new React Native project, right? And in this example, we're talking about React Native, but it's possible that other mobile frameworks would work as well. We're going to initialize Amplify for React Native. We're going to then again add our backend services, deploy the backend services. Then we're going to integrate with our React Native app. And then, of course, we're going to run our native app. All right. So what do the backend services consist of, right? So we'll touch on these a little bit. So first, as we mentioned before, I didn't list it here because we already mentioned it, but there's going to be the initialization of the backend services. And then we're going to be adding those backend services, which would consist of authentication, APIs, storage, databases, and a lot more things that happen in the background that you do not see on the front end. But all of those power the front end. All right. Then there's service configuration. Each backend service is added to the project requires configuration. The Amplify command line interface prompts developers to provide necessary information such as service types, resource names, and settings. Then we move on to local development. So during development, developers can work with their backend services locally before deploying it to the cloud. The Amplify command line interface provides a local development environment that simulates AWS services on the developer's machine. So that's very cool to work locally and then push to the cloud. Amplify also provides code generation. It generates code artifacts and configuration files based on the developer's input. These artifacts are used to interact with backend services from the front end or mobile application. And then we move on to deployment, a part of the backend services. After local development and testing, developers use the Amplify push command to deploy the configured backend services to the AWS cloud. This command creates the necessary AWS resources and provisions the infrastructure. And we keep moving along. We have the AWS cloud resources. Amplify backend services leverage various AWS services under the hood. For example, authentication, as we mentioned. AWS Cognito is used often for user authentication. APIs, AWS AppSync or Amazon API Gateway can be used for GraphQL or RESTful APIs. Storage, Amazon S3 is commonly used for file storage, and then with databases, options include Amazon DynamoDB, Amazon Aurora, or others depending on the selected service. Then we move on to managed services. AWS Amplify abstracts the complexity of managing and scaling these AWS services. Developers don't need to worry about server provisioning, scaling, or maintenance. AWS takes care of all of that in the background, which is super helpful because if you are a developer, right, and you're not too familiar with the infrastructure part, you can spend countless hours trying to understand, like trying to provision the size of servers, storage, or you can like worry about the things that you are like that's your responsibility in developing, and then let AWS Amplify take care of the rest for you, setting up your infrastructure and things like that. All right, so then we go to monitoring and analytics. So AWS Amplify provides monitoring and analytics feature, allowing developers to track and to track the performance and the usage of their backend services. This includes metrics, logs, and analytics dashboards. So remember the other day when we were working on Grafana, working on setting that up for our security incident and event management, right? So this is all like, we're seeing how all these things integrate and come together. And then there is scaling. As the application grows, AWS automatically scales the underlying infrastructure to handle increased demand. This ensures the application built with Amplify can handle varying workloads and user traffic. So based on what you build, like let's say there are seasons that you get a lot more traffic than others, then it can automatically scale your application. And then once the traffic dies down, it should be able to scale it down as well, right? And then we finish up with continuous deployment. AWS Amplify supports continuous deployment workflows. Changes to the backend services can be deployed automatically through CI/CD, continuous integration, and continuous deployment pipelines, ensuring a smooth and efficient development process. So, in summary, for all that we read, AWS Amplify. So, in summary, for all that we mentioned, AWS Amplify backend services simplifies the process of setting up, configuring, and deploying server-side components for mobile and web applications. By abstracting away much of the infrastructure management, developers can focus more on building features and less on the underlying complexities of cloud infrastructure, which is what I just mentioned, right? So it just helps scale down to so you can focus on the things that you are good at, and you don't have to necessarily worry about the infrastructure if it can do that for you. Okay, so let's move on to the front end frameworks. So Amazon Web Services doesn't provide its own front-end frameworks. Instead, it offers services and tools that can be integrated into various front-end frameworks to enhance the development of web and mobile applications. Developers can use AWS services in conjunction with other popular front-end frameworks like React, Angular, or Vue.js. And it can also, and there's guides to help you get started with all of that too. So have no fear. There are tons of tutorials out there that would help you get started. So let's talk about some real world scenarios. So the very first real world scenario is the time cost calculator that I assembled, that I put together based in React, right? Just a very simple front end calculator. You put in some numbers in there, and then it does a calculation to calculate the how much an hour of your time is actually worth. So I put a link in there. I'll put a link in the description so you can see. Like honestly, there's nothing that you can look at it that'll tell you that it's being hosted on AWS Amplify. When I was working on deploying it to get it out there on the internet. Somehow I stumbled across AWS Amplify, followed the steps, and then it took it from GitHub and it deployed it to AWS Amplify. So it's pretty easy, pretty cool. And that calculator is based on React, right? And then I have a quotes app that my tech barbarians built that I'm going to be deploying soon. I did a live stream trying to get it deployed using AWS Amplify over the weekend. This past weekend, you can check that out. I'll pin a link to it. But I was able to get that set up with Terraform. We ran into a little snag at the end, but I'm definitely going to finish that up and get that working. But that app just uses Express for a backend API and some vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to get the quotes to load. And then there are serverless applications that AWS Amplify can also work with. So, and a scenario for that would be developing serverless applications without managing the underlying infrastructure. And the Amplify features that would be used is the AWS Lambda functions, API gateway, and authentication. So those are like 3 examples to name a few, but there are a wide variety of different uses for AWS Amplify, such as progressive web apps, content management systems, e-commerce applications if you're selling things online, collaborative applications where there's real-time updates and user interaction. So many different things that you can use it for. So just wanted to name a few and show that it is there's a world of possibilities out there. So what are some of the best practices for using AWS Amplify? So we'll just go down the list, right? So number 1 would say use version control. Like I put Git because that's probably the most popular one, right? And then there is environment management. So with environment management, you want to utilize different environments of development, staging, production to avoid accidental changes to critical resources, right? So that's just separating your environments. You don't want to do everything in production. That is crazy, right? And then there are the segregation of services, separate backend services logically using categories in the Amplify CLI, and that's going to improve organization and simplify maintenance, right? Use CI, CD, continuous integration and continuous deployment. There are authentication best practices that we cover many times on, like when we're talking about security, especially cybersecurity. So just let me name a few. Enforce strong password policies for user authentication. Use multi-factor authentication for additional security. Like as you've seen, we've gone over this on the bug bite. People like companies not using not enforcing multi-factor authentication, they end up in a mess. And then there's monitor and log authentication events for auditing purposes, right? So there goes some more SIM talk right there for the security incident and event management. So now the next thing, you want to secure your API access. You want to encrypt sensitive data at rest and in transit, so data security. We want to have strong monitoring and logging, so implement logging for both front-end and back-end services. So you have to see what's going on both sides, right? It's not only on one. So you can use the AWS CloudWatch for monitoring and logging. And then there is performance optimization, where you optimize front-end code for performance. So, so your site can load fast. You don't want it to be like going slow. Consider aspects like lazy loading and minimizing requests. Then there is the cost management. So make sure get your costs under control. You don't want to be spending a fortune by having the wrong configuration. And of course, testing. Conduct thorough testing, including unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end tests, right? We talk about that all the time, having proper testing. Leverage AWS tools like AWS Device Farm for mobile app testing as well. So we've played around with AWS Device Farm. It is amazing. So definitely look into that. And then there is documentation. Maintain comprehensive documentation for your Amplify project, including infrastructure, configurations, and deployment procedures, right? So very, very important, because if somebody picks up on it, you want them to be able to hit the ground running. You don't want to cause any confusion, and it helps you down the road as well to know what you did and things like that, right? So very, very helpful. And then just to round it out, there is backup and disaster recovery. So making sure you regularly back up your important data. Don't let anything get lost by chance. Things do get lost. Updates and patching. We've read in the bug bite previously, like companies got bitten because they didn't patch their software. So always continue to update and patch your software with the latest versions of Amplify libraries. And then we have community and resource. So engage with the AWS Amplify community for support and insights. And lastly, to top it off, security audits. Periodically conduct security audits to identify and address vulnerabilities. All right, stay informed about security advisories related to the components and their libraries. Right. So if you follow these best practices, you can ensure security, reliability, and efficiency of your application built with AWS Amplify. Keep in mind that best practices may evolve with updates to AWS services and the Amplify framework. So always stay up to date. Keep your eyes on the news for these technologies so that your application can stay safe, secure, and running like a champ. All right. So in conclusion, we discussed what exactly is AWS Amplify and how it can be useful to you, some of the key aspects of AWS Amplify, how to get started with AWS Amplify, what are some of the backends, like how does the backend services work, how do the front-end development work on it, and then we looked over some real world use cases, including some of the applications that I've used with AWS Amplify. And we went over the best practices, and we spoke about the different community and resources that you can get, so that you can get help and updates, so you can make your app a successful build and deployment. All right. So with that being said, if you have any questions or feedback, if you think I got something wrong, if you think there's a better tool out there than AWS Amplify, please let me know in the comments. I am so curious to hear your point of view, your thoughts. But yeah, so definitely hit me up. Let me know. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Whatever the case may be. So I am anxious to talk to you. All right. So on that note, I want to thank you for tuning in to another episode of Software Explorations, Concept and Overviews, where we discussed AWS Amplify. I hope you found that useful and informative. If you did, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you can know every time that we go live or we drop a new video. Like the video, share the video with anyone you can think of, and check out the Patreon at www.techcoachralph.dev, and we will go from there. But until next time, this has been another episode of Software Explorations. This is Tech Coach Ralph signing off.
If you enjoyed the fascinating information shared in this video and you want more, be sure to hit the subscribe button to Tech Coach Ralph to be notified for new videos.